Estimates for the Columbia-class submarine program are around $100 billion, and the Navy wants to build 12 of these submarines. Do you agree that we need 12, and how would you fund the costly program?
I think the first question that we have to ask is, do our men and women in uniform have everything they need to do their jobs, given the current threat situation in the world, and to the best of our knowledge of how we can predict what's going to be happening in the future? When we look at the world today, as I mentioned earlier, we are no longer in a post-Cold War period. We're really in a new second Cold War. And what that means to us is those who seek to harm us are increasing their military spending, including Russians with their submarines. There's a greater threat to the American homeland. We need to have the submarines. We can have the best men and women in uniform and the best technology, but a submarine can only be one place at one time. When we see the pivot to the Pacific, it leaves the Atlantic, and as Joe said, with the Arctic, if there is some change there with the ice, we could be seeing more Russian and Chinese subs coming down into the Atlantic. We need to fund these submarines, and we need to do it in an effective way, and we can do that by growing the economy. Right now, our economy has like 62% workforce participation, way too low.
Thank you. And just to clarify for our audience, what we're talking about is whether we should be building a successor to the Trident missile, ballistic missile launching submarine, and if so, how do we pay for it? Mr. Pelto.
This is where we get the problem associated with the important jobs that Joe and others have worked to protect and don't have alternatives. I got my start in politics working as an aide to Congressman Chris Dodd when he was the congressman from this congressional district in the late 70s. And Chris Dodd would go around talking about the importance of submarines, but he'd also talk about defense conversion. If those defense conversion activities had taken place, we now would be able to be building things like rail cars here in southeastern Connecticut instead of submarines. I don't believe that the submarines are necessary for our safety. I recognize, though, that there are thousands of important jobs, and it's not too late to begin the kind of defense conversion that would allow us to be building products for society as opposed to weapons of war. To have a 15 or 20 or 25% set aside on all defense contracts requiring that defense contractors use those funds. The state of Connecticut is buying new train cars. The choices that had been made is a Japanese company, a German company, and a French company. That just doesn't make sense for where the United States is, and we can build those train cars if we convert our defense industries.
Thank you. Mr. Reale.
I believe in defending the actual United States, unlike my opponents. So I would suggest that begins with bringing the troops home for real, not for just pretend, not for, hey, I'm Democrat, vote for me in another 2 years and I'll think about contemplating this again. And you would get the savings to implement, these votes, which I believe we're going to need, because unfortunately, with bipartisan policy, we've hit quite the hornet's nest. So we have to be a little prepared if anything changes based on that. But the other areas I would get the savings, you can see it on danrealeforcongress.com, meaningful healthcare savings without spending a single taxpayer dime. And one thing I do put forward is I would also deal with the student debt fraud and the mortgage fraud, which in turn would free up a lot of money, and that would actually create economic growth, because unlike what Daria is saying, we can't just grow by cutting taxes. We need to remove the junk debt. So that pretty much solves it.
Representative Courtney.
So one of the most overlooked accomplishments of President Obama and Hillary Clinton was negotiating the New START Treaty, which reduced the size of nuclear stockpiles for the U.S. and Russian nuclear forces. After that was completed, the Navy and the military, the Pentagon, did a review in terms of what platforms would be part of our system for ballistic defense. And the Navy and the submarine component of the triad is now going to be roughly about 70% of that force. Our fleet of Tridents are going to time out, and the fact is this is a replacement program, the Columbia-class. It will be a smaller fleet, by the way. It's 12, not 14. And the question is, how do you do it affordably? I have been deeply involved in acquisition reform in terms of trying to get more efficiencies with multi-year purchasing of materials and planning. And in fact, the Congressional Budget Office gave the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund, which I created with Congressman Randy Forbes, a score that we would save $10 billion off the top line that Julia mentioned in her question. So the fact is we can be smart about how we build and pay for this. And again, I think it's an essential component of the nuclear umbrella.
Luca, you wanted to comment further?
I
Ms.
do. There's
Novak?
so much I want to say. I'm going to go as fast as I can. You know what? As far as troops overseas, we don't need to be involved in civil affairs of other nation states, but we have to support our allies when we have mutual defense agreements. We need them to trust us. Russians are rebuilding their military. We're looking at 2020 having a fully modernized army. Fifth-generation drone subs the Russians are putting out. Admiral Harris in our Pacific Command is talking about the fact he can only meet 43% of his needs for combatant commanders. We need to be realistic about what is happening in the world.
Thank you. And when you talk about conversion, Mr. Pelto, they're talking about converting from this particular submarines, or what are we converting?
I mean, in general, that as important as these jobs are, and the fact that we need the expenditures both for the jobs and for some of these platforms for our national defense, although I think there's tremendous waste and fraud and corruption that's been brought on by the military-industrial complex, but that in all of these areas we need to be converting defense industries to products that are going to add more to our society than simply weapons of war.
I'm going to ask, and then we'll get back to Mr. Reale if you want to comment, but I want to, if Representative Courtney could elaborate on the idea you've proposed for trying to fund this program without busting the defense budget. If you could take your 30 seconds to briefly explain that.
Sure. So if you look at historically, the Navy, when they had a shortage of sea lift, which are the cargo ships and the troop ships back in the 1990s, they created a separate fund to build and pay for the sea lift command, as it's called. Congressman Forbes and I basically used that concept to enact the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund, which sets up a separate account to deal with the Columbia-class, because this is once in a multi-generation expenditure. This is not a recurring expense that's going to happen year in and year out. If we don't do it, it's going to have an impact in terms of the shipbuilding budget for the rest of the fleet. And Jonathan's right. The Ford carrier is a problem. There's some efficiencies that we need to look at there in the LCS program. But the fact of the matter is our fleet size needs to grow.
All right.
And that's how you pay for it.
Mr. Reale, your comment on that approach to trying to pay for it, a separate account?
I mean, this is kind of a side issue, but it has to be brought up. Is the Navy just recently decided to change the ranking system, which basically you're no longer a radar man, you're like an E3, B50 or something like that, and it's pretty confusing to a lot of people. I mean, this is a district that has a lot of Navy personnel. I think we should deal with a lot of the way we treat sailors as well, because if we don't treat them right, we're going to end up with more costs additionally.
And as we wrap up this question, I could just hear from Mr. Pelto and from Ms. Novak on this idea. It's such an important defense program of setting up this separate account to make it possible. Whether you agree with that approach or not, if we could hear from those two candidates, beginning with Mr. Pelto.
I would disagree with. I understand that that's what the congressman is pushing for as a way to get funding, but with 50% of our discretionary budget already spent on defense, I think we have to come to grips within that defense budget of what are the priorities, and if in fact this platform is the priority, then it needs to take the place of other items.
And Ms. Novak.
I would just say, if you look at what's happening around the world, let's just look at the South China Sea and what China's doing, the number of submarines China is building today. We have to look at the reality. 70% of the world's oceanic commercial traffic goes through the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. China will be able to control it, the air, the sea. We have to be realistic, the world that we're living in today. Being strong, having advanced systems is what has kept us safe, peace through strength, and have helped us to avoid war. So I would support the subs all the way.
So that sounds like it's a yes? That you would support that approach if you were elected instead of Mr. Courtney? The approach that he described of setting up the separate account? I just wanted to clarify.
For me.
Yes.
If we needed to. And I'm not trying to get out of it. I really want to relook totally. It would be too long to discuss the whole defense budget.
Very good. The next question is to Mr. Pelto.